Mr. Darryl David.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, as Singaporeans become increasingly reliant on digital communications enabled by the internet and various mobile messaging apps, the male profile in Singapore has correspondingly changed substantially. In the last decade, the male volume of letters has declined by almost 30%. At the same time, the volume of non-letters, such as small packages and parcels, have increased, largely driven by the proliferation of online shopping platforms and changing consumption patterns. Although there's a certain nostalgia associated with receiving Christmas or handwritten Christmas or Chinese New Year cards, we are now more likely to receive festive greeting gifts on our mobile phones than physical greeting cards in our mailboxes. That's the reality of life. In the era of internet-enabled communications and given the ubiquity of online shopping, our postal services need to progress with time. A new framework needs to be set up to enable our postal service provider to meet changing patterns of communications and to close the last-mile delivery gap for small packages and parcels for consumers. I am thus heartened to know that the amendments to the Postal Services Act have made provisions for IMDA to deploy a standardized national network of parcel lockers via a wholly owned subsidiary or through an appointed vendor. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I would imagine that parcel locker services are presently, at best, scattered across Singapore and are operated by different operators with differing operational standards and charges. This fragmentation would make it challenging for merchants to adopt a standardized approach to last-mile delivery and for consumers to have a reliable method to receive their parcels when they shop from different online merchants that might perhaps use different locker platforms, depending on their tie-ups and partnerships with those providers and vendors. I thus believe that market consolidation in the parcel locker service will help to minimize current market disamenities, such as differing operational standards, non-systematic deployment of lockers, and deployment of competing lockers in already congested public spaces. That being said, we ought to be mindful about potential unintended consequences in IMDA's implementation of such a nationwide service. First, is there the possibility that a single player will end up dominating the market, and thus the market is not subject to competitive market forces? In short, how can we ensure that the service will be affordable for consumers and that this single vendor, should there end up being a single vendor, will also continue to innovate and introduce new services when it is not subjected to competition from other vendors? Ensuring long-term affordability of such a locker service is important because such a service is an effective alternative solution to door-to-door delivery. We've already heard from some of our colleagues about the challenges of waiting at home to receive some of their parcels and their deliveries. At the present moment, door-to-door delivery requires some degree of coordination also between merchants and consumers to ensure that someone is at home. Now, this results in opportunity cost for consumers in terms of time loss, as they must remain at home when their time could have been better spent on other activities. Secondly, if the aim is to appoint a single vendor, then would this end up perhaps favoring large industry players that have the financial muscle and resources to tender and implement the project on a national level? Could this lead effectively to the demise of smaller players in the industry and perhaps even affecting door-to-door courier services adversely when demand for such services decline? Would IMDA thus consider working with some of the smaller industry players that might not necessarily run the nationwide network but are still able to contribute to its running in meaningful ways? Thirdly, since the early 2000s, the government has tried to minimize the installation of dustbins, for example, in crowded confined spaces such as MRT stations or bus interchanges, as these receptacles could be used to hide improvised explosive devices, or IEDs, which could cause mass casualties. I'm surfacing a point that has been, I think, repeated quite a few times already by my other parliamentary colleagues. So the question is that how would IMDA ensure that the locker service will not be misused by nefarious individuals to hide hazardous biomaterials or IEDs that could cause mass casualties or widespread panic during an incident? How would the authorities ensure the safety and security of such a locker system? Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, digitalization has a pervasive impact on many aspects of our lives and has changed the way we communicate with each other and how we consume goods and services. My clarifications notwithstanding, I am heartened that the government has introduced this Postal Services Bill to reflect the consumer landscape of today and conclude my speech in firm support of this bill. Thank you.